Today is March 21st, 2013, and we are at the Robert F. Kidder Library speaking with Mr. Buddy Griffin about his life, his service to Glenville State College, and everything in between.
I was in uniform, although this is not the... I always tell people I was in uniform in the 60s, Boy Scout. Yeah, and that was as far as I got. I guess they didn't want me in the military, I don't know. Being a banjo player, they wouldn't, I guess.
How's your name on your birth certificate? Your full name?
Buddy Mason Griffin.
Okay, and when were you born, sir?
You asked me a question too quick. September 22nd, 1948.
Okay. Where were you born, sir?
Richwood, West Virginia. Sacred Heart Hospital.
Okay.
Right on the Cherry River.
Did you and your family spend much time in Richmond?
Not Richmond.
I mean,
Richwood.
Richwood.
Actually, we lived in Summersville. We lived in Summersville, and that was the nearest hospital. I was probably the second or third one in the family to be born in a hospital. The rest of them came along at home, or the ones before me. And although we did travel to Richwood a lot, I mean, what is it, 30 miles from Summersville? But we lived in Summersville for I guess until I was a junior in high school, or until I finished my junior year in high school. Then we moved to Braxton County.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about your parents and possibly even your grandparents. Did you know your grandparents?
Oh, yeah, I sure did. Now, I did not know the grandparents on my mother's side. Grandmother on mother's side died at a fairly early age. Her father lived probably 3 or 4 years into my lifetime, and I remember him just vaguely, but I remember him.
Okay.
You know, always dressed well. I remember that. He was dressed in a suit, always.
Okay, what was their names?
Her name was Anna Pearl Ray, and that was her maiden name.
Okay.
She married Wallace Cutlip, and so they were my grandparents on mom's side. Mother was Irma Virginia Cutlip.
Okay. How about the grandparents on your
I knew them very well. They both lived well into their 90s. Granddad lived to be 104. And I even knew his mother, my great-grandmother. She lived to be, they could prove 112, but they suspect 116 when she died. And she died in Nichols County. In fact, there was a big article in the News Leader or the West Virginia Hillbilly, one of those Richwood publications, about her as being the oldest citizen in Nichols County, and I dare say probably in the state at that time. But there's no proof that she was 116 when she died, but they, you know, the birth certificates and all the records that they had said that she was 112. But Granddad lived to be 104, grandmother to 93, and so they both died in the 1980s.
What would you contribute that longevity to?
Boy, that's another good question. I don't think I have it. I would have died of a heart attack if it hadn't been for medical science. But you know, but who knows? Hard work. Everybody says hard work. You know, but I don't remember grandmother doing any hard physical labor, and she lived to be 93. Dad lived to be 92. But I don't know. You know, it could have been the fact that neither of them smoked. It could have been the fact that they worked on the farm all the time. I mean, it could be a lot of things. They discovered that my granddad had an onset of diabetes when he was in his 80s, and he probably would have died of that much earlier if they hadn't found it and treated him. And as it were, he lived to be, already he had lived to be 80 years old or more. So it's hard to say. I don't know. He certainly worked hard on the farm. I don't remember that he worked hard after that.
What was the majority of food supply for even your grandparents and parents?
Well, until the Summersville Dam came along in the early 1960s, or until probably 1960 or 61. We lived on the farm, so most of the food we ate was from the farm. I mean, we'd buy staples, we'd buy, we didn't raise beans, but we ate a lot of them, so we had to buy those at the store. And any meat, maybe bacon, eggs, things like that. We had chickens, so we had eggs. Had a milk cow, but I don't recall that we had a lot of milk then. But just basic stuff. I know there was a huge strawberry patch on the farm, so I ate a lot of strawberries. I don't know about the rest of them, but I sure did. And apples, we had an apple orchard, so, I mean, we just ate pretty much what the land provided at that time. Did not have running water, and so had outdoor toilets, and you took your bath on Saturday like everybody else, and so you had to carry that either from the spring out the lane from the house and heat it up. So there was a fire going constantly on Friday and Saturday. It seemed like, but that I don't know how much difference that made in how long they lived. I mean, it could be that they just lived a clean life. You just who knows.
Okay.
It'd be hard to say.
What kind of memories do you have of your early life there in Summersville?
The early life, probably until I was 5 or 6 years old, it's always kind of sketchy. I know where we lived was a little place called Sleepy Hollow, which was a little street off of Route 39. As you head from Summersville toward Richwood on the old road, and of course my grandparents lived right next door, and there were lots of things. Of course you always get an imprint of what that place looked like, and it's hard to really relate that to other people. We've actually recently gone back and looked to see if we could find pictures that might show us the old house. My sister Louise, who's 8 or 9 years older than me, is writing a book on the family history, and so we've gone out and looked for some. But basically, what I remember was I remember listening to the radio a lot when I was a kid. We had a TV, but of course, in those days, in the early 1950s, you didn't have TV for 24 hours. You had it maybe for 4 hours in the evening, and then it was off the air until the next day around 4 o'clock. And at some point in the early 50s, that might have stretched back to noon or 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. But it was still off the air, until the next day. That time, maybe in the late 50s, we started seeing a lot of 24-hour television, but not much. But specifically, I remember radio, because I'd listen to The Shadow. Some of those things were still being broadcast in the early 50s.
Yes.
Well, lots of them were. I remember listening to particular stations. We'd always listen to the Grand Ole Opry, always. I mean, that was Saturday night fare there. And I remember listening early in the morning to WSM radio, and you'd hear people like Hank Williams, you'd hear Flat and Scruggs, you'd hear, all the major acts that were coming out of Nashville at the time. Carl Smith, Ernest Tubb, all those people. So they were on the radio, and there were other radio programs going on as well. I know we listened to WMMN in Fairmont a lot, and there were some country music people there, because that's pretty much what we listened to at home.
And all those stations came in fairly well?
Oh yeah. Well, in those days, you especially in the wintertime, you would get a lot of those big AM stations a lot clearer at night
Yes.
because of the sunspots and you know, and the interference from the radiation of the sun.
Uh-huh.
But at night, you could just pretty much guarantee you're going to pick up those stations. In the daytime, you were pretty well limited to the closer stations. You know, the ones from Summersville. I think we listened to Charleston stations. 2 or 3 Charleston stations we listened to. There was a station in Montgomery at that time that really had good music, and music's what our household was about anyway. So you know, naturally we were going to listen to music, and then we'd pick up a couple stations. Where was? Oh, there was one in Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. I can't remember the name of the station, but it had a program on it called the Old Dominion Barn Dance. It was in Richmond, WRVA.
Okay.
And I guess which stood for the W for the radio station, but Richmond, Virginia, I guess is what that stood for. Because it's always confused with WWVA, which is Wheeling, and the Wheeling Jamboree. But I know we listened to a lot of radio. Mom and Dad sang to us a lot, you know, when we were a kid. That they would get their instruments, and while we were all out in the yard along the creek, you know, doing what kids do, you know, play, they would sit on the front porch and sing. And this was when in good weather. This was just almost every day. You know, Dad would get home from work around 5 o'clock, and we'd eat, and next thing you know, we're all outside, and they got the guitars out there singing. So that went on a lot.
How many brothers and sisters did you have?
There were 8 of us. One died as an infant. That was James. Ruth was born in 1939. Mom and Dad were married in 38. She was born in 1939. Louise in 1940. My brother Johnny, who's now passed away, was born in 43. James, the infant who passed away, was born in 46. Lucille, my closest sister, it was born in 47. I was in 48. Mom and Dad were busy. You know, they pretty much stayed at this family thing. And then after me, and I don't know what the reason for this was, but there was not another child come along for another 6 years. So I guess maybe when they got me, they thought, do we want to do this again? You know, you have to think that. I'm sure that wasn't it. But that was Janet. She was born in 54, and then Pamela was born in 57.
Okay. So there wasn't much as far as music coming from your grandparents either side.
Surprisingly, and in fact, my granddad was a banjo player.
Oh, really?
But I didn't know that until his 100th birthday. Now, don't ask me how I never knew that, but I played banjo all from 1962 on, and never knew that he played banjo until his 100th birthday. And he told me, he said he used to play banjo, and he'd go along, because I think he was born in Roane County, near Spencer. But he would travel around to some of those logging camps back over in Spencer and Calhoun County, maybe some in Gilmer County too, with an old-time fiddler named Enoch Camp. I never heard the name again. Don't even know where to look, but I'm sure it's something about him somewhere. But they traveled around to logging camps and played around the turn of the century. Granddad was born in 1883, so he would have been a strapping teenager, you know. So I asked my dad one time, I said, well, I wonder how come Granddad never told me he played the banjo. And Dad just looked at me just real calmly and said, I guess he never thought of it. But nobody ever told me that. I do remember that Granddad, when I started playing fiddle, Granddad called me aside, you know, grandfather to grandson story here. called me aside and he said, "Son, you're a good banjo player." He said, "I really like to hear you play the banjo." He said, "But you're starting to pick up the fiddle." And he said, "You need to put that down. Just leave it alone." He said, "It's nothing but trouble. It's devil's instrument." That's what he was telling me.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know how sincere he was. It probably was sincere. But I think what he was really saying was, you don't sound very good on the fiddle. You don't try to play that. But a few years later, after he told me that, I had stopped by his house, and my uncle GC had a watch repair shop right beside their house. And so I'd always go over to Uncle GC's, and he had a bunch of fiddles, so I would be over there visiting, playing fiddle. And my granddad was in there talking to his doctor that day. Now, the granddad by that time was in his 90s, and I just heard him, just while I was playing, I heard him tell the doctor, he said, "That's my grandson there playing the fiddle." So I must have improved or got to the point where he thought, okay, I can accept this. I always thought that was funny that he told me one thing and then, told the doctor something else.
Yes.
Or was bragging, that's the way it was. But granddad was a good guy. He used to come and pick me up and take me traipsing out through the woods with him. He'd be looking for ginseng or he'd be looking for mushrooms or something, and sometimes he'd just want to go walking through the woods, So, you get a lot of upbringing going on those trips with granddad. So, yeah, he's quite a character.
What did he do for a living?
Oh, he did everything. He was, having gone through a couple depressions, and never served time in the military. He was when World War I started, he already had a family and they probably couldn't find him anyway. Spanish-American War, he might have been just about the age for that, but some reason he never went into the military. Of course, by the time World War II came along, he was too old, certainly. But he farmed and he logged and traded, whatever they'd have to do in order to make a living or to get money to eat on, So not so dissimilar from what I do for a living, go out and play music and make a few dollars here and there, and it adds to the coffers, But that's pretty much what he did, and grandmother was just a housewife,
How about your parents? What did they do?
Dad, I mentioned a minute ago that Uncle GC, Dad's brother, had a watch repair shop, but they had actually, after World War II, they both served in the military, and after World War II, they came home and they decided, because communications was a big thing. Dad had gone into it in the military, and was a radio man and repair person, and so
he was involved in World War II.
Oh yeah, Uncle GC went through Africa up into the Mediterranean, through Italy, and back into France. So, he saw the German side of it. Dad was in the Pacific.
Okay.
So, Dad was a bit younger, so he didn't go into the army when Uncle GC did. In fact, he didn't go until the last couple of years of the war, but and was training in the Philippines for the invasion of Japan when the war ended. So, but I think probably the closest any of us were to an atomic explosion had been Dad, But anyway, when he came back out of the war, he and my Uncle GC went into business together. They started a radio first repair business and sales and repair, and then TV started catching on. Dad went back to school, and he repaired TVs and sold them and installed them and antennas and all that stuff, and that's what he did for a living. And in the early 50s up through the early 60s, when color television was starting to get really big, he had more than enough work that he needed, so it was.
And he operated this business out of where?
Summersville.
Summersville.
Yeah. Yeah, they were I mean, for about, pretty close to 20 years. I mean, that was just very successful business, very successful. And but Dad's health started failing considerably in the early 60s. And so he just decided, instead of being in business for himself, he'd rather work for somebody else. Mm-hmm. So then that's what he did. He moved to Braxton County, took a job with the company there, did some work for the radio station, but mostly just repaired TVs and radios and that kind of thing. And until he retired. So,
well, what do you contribute, or what do you think spurred your parents' interest in music so much?
I think, there's a lot of things. Dad played guitar from day one, and who knows what got him interested. Granddad played the banjo, but I don't think they owned one. Grandmother wouldn't let him have one in the house, But Dad, I think, he was the only one in that family, as far as brothers and sisters go, that played any musical instruments early on. Mm-hmm. So I think he probably was impressed. I'm gonna guess probably by just hearing some of the local people play. About the only place they could frequent. Of course, there was church. There was always music in church, but it was usually an organ or nothing at all. But I think he probably was impressed by some of the guitar players and the fiddlers just around the area. He might go down to by the time he was up in his teens, he might sneak into one of the local beer joints where they were playing music, and truthfully, I never even asked him that question, so I don't know. I just assumed that he certainly didn't pick it up from records and television and radio, But I would guess that that he picked it up pretty much from just hearing other people play around the area. And I know there was one uncle, I think, that played, one of his uncles, and I don't know which one that was, but might have been on grandmother's side. Anyway, he had a guitar, and Mother actually, concurrently, before they knew each other, she'd learned to play the guitar too. But popular music at that time was generally the Carter family. We're talking about in the early 1930s here. Carter family had recorded in 1927 for RCA, or for Ralph Peer, and so on the radio, or if somebody had an old crank phonograph, chances are they're going to have a Carter family record on it. So Mom and Dad learned all that stuff. Then when they got together, they had so much in common musically. They just did what they thought they ought to do, and they got married.
Uh-huh. When did you first realize that you thought you wanted to do that too?
I think early on. I played guitar before I started school. And in fact, I remember my brother bringing the old Gibson archtop guitar that belonged to my mom to school and dropping it off in my first grade classroom. This was in Summersville. And the teacher wanted me to play and sing for the kids. And I did. I sang the old little kid's song about I was a kid then. Mm-hmm. The spider coming up the water spout. Uh-huh. Oh, what was that thing called?
Itsy Bitsy.
Itsy Bitsy Spider, yeah. But anyway, I sang that for the first grade class, and of course, my voice was way up here then at that time. But it was probably, I probably knew by that time that music was going to be a major part of my life. And when I actually got the bug, it's there, it's a hobby, and you're no good. And then there's a point at which you think, I can do this. this is not going to be hard for me. And so I think that came along probably maybe in the 6th grade, because by that time I was playing not really complicated stuff on the guitar, but I was getting more in depth into it. And we had a bass fiddle at home, and I don't remember seeing anybody play it ever. In fact, I think Dad let somebody borrow it, and they chopped it up for stove wood. I don't know what they did, but we never got it back. But I remember even when I was, in the 1st or 2nd grade, or maybe before, standing up on the couch, and there'd be some fiddlers or somebody there, and I knew what the strings were and how they associated ear-wise to the music. So I could pluck the strings in time and go along with the music till I ran out of strings, and then I'd have to wait until they came back to a chord that the string matched. I couldn't get my hand around the bass fiddle. So bass fiddle and guitar, it seems like I knew that stuff before I even knew that I knew it, But I think the thing that really catapulted me into music as a vocation was the banjo. I mean, I loved the banjo.
When do you think you started picking a banjo?
Oh, I know. I can tell you the date.
Okay.
It doesn't make any difference. I can tell you the date that I picked one up the first time. But suffice to say, it was October of 1962. I was in the 8th grade, and I liked the banjo, and I liked guitar, and I was getting involved in some of the music that Mom and Dad were doing, at home, and I'd go out on some things, when they were playing. Mother didn't go out so much then, but she did later on. But I heard the Beverly Hillbillies theme song on the banjo, and it wouldn't have made any difference what the song was, but I heard it, and I heard the sound of Earl Scruggs' banjo, and I thought, I can do that, And I sat down that night. My dad, some of the musicians were at the house playing, and I'd been to a Boy Scout meeting and came home and watched the Beverly Hillbillies, probably the 1st or 2nd show that they did, and heard that music, and I thought, oh my goodness. And it's just, have you ever been out in the cold and you walk into a building and all of a sudden the heat just hits you in the face? That's what it was like. When I heard that sound, it was just like, ooh, all of a sudden blood started rushing to my head, and it's something. It's like falling in love. You never get past that, and that's what the banjo did for me. And it's I think I sat down that night and worked out the melody of that tune, kind of almost doing it right, but then.
So you did have a banjo in your house? There
was a banjo there, but it was not really what you'd call a good banjo. It was just a, some kind of an old cheap thing, I don't know what it was. But I had not picked it up. I had not had it in my hands. I don't know why, because I was really interested in guitar. But that night, my dad drove a couple of the musicians home. They lived about 3 or 4 miles away. A couple of the musicians home, because he had to go pick them up, And then he came back, and I remember my mother calling him into the kitchen when he walked back in the house and said, "You got to hear this," And so I was sitting there fooling with the banjo back in the bedroom, I think. And Dad came over and he said, "If you learn to play that like Ralph Stanley, I'll get you the best Gibson they make." I wasn't really particularly a Ralph Stanley fan, but I was an Earl Scruggs fan. So he settled for Earl Scruggs, But I'd say within probably, that was October, November, December, January. By January 1st, and the reason I remember that date is Dad had to take my brother back to catch the train because he was in the Navy, had to go to Great Lakes, Illinois. Um, so that day, I just spent all day with the banjo. And I learned, just sat down and worked out a bunch of the tunes and a bunch of the patterns with the three fingers on the banjo. And when Dad came back, I was playing Foggy Mountain Breakdown. I was playing a couple other Earl Scruggs tunes, Foggy Mountain Chimes. Those were big tunes back then. And the following day, and I did not know this until it arrived in April sometime, but the following day, Dad got on the line, called up the Gibson Musical Instrument Company in Chicago, and he arranged for a franchise of Gibson instruments there at his TV and radio repair shop. And as he did that, he had to order instruments, So he ordered the best banjo Gibson made at that time, which was an RB 250, and he ordered it and didn't tell me about it, And this banjo just showed up at the house about the first or second week of April in 1963. And so from that point on, I was just the banjo player,
Do you still have that banjo?
No. The interesting story, at that particular time, Dad's health, or not at that time, but over the next 2 or 3 years, his health had just started to fail really badly. And of course, nobody had anything like health insurance or anything like that, so you could go to the doctor when you could afford to. But he had been out of work for like almost a month at that time. And so somebody came to the house who was looking for a good Gibson banjo. And I'd known this guy for 2 or 3 years because I'd seen him play guitar. And he said, "How much would you take for that banjo?" Of course, Dad had bought it, so I said, "Well, ask Dad, He said, "Well, we paid over $300 for it when we bought it brand new." And the guy said, "Tell you what I'll do." He said, "I'll give you $300 in this banjo." And he pulled a banjo out of the case. And it was the fanciest looking banjo I'd ever seen. It was, it turned out to be, and I didn't know at the time, a Gibson, probably from the 1920s or 30s, a Gibson RB11 banjo. RB stood for regular banjo. And it was same size as any normal banjo, except the neck of it, where you fretboard of the neck, it just looked like it was just covered with pearl. It was actually some sort of plastic stuff with underneath it had designs painted on it. It was really a fancy looking banjo, and it turns out that banjo was a collector's item. Mm-hmm. And I could have gotten maybe $1,000 out of that banjo if I'd known the value of it. But I didn't know the value of it. And so Dad said, "Well, if you want to trade," he said, "we could sure use the money." And I said, "Done, swap it out." And I never did like the sound of that banjo, but it's a funny thing. A lot of the bluegrass bands that traveled around and played would play at the drive-in movie theaters.
Okay. And
so about, I'd say 2 or 3 months after that, Ralph Stanley, as actually then it was the Stanley Brothers, were performing at the Craigsville Drive-In Movie Theater. And so I went up to see them, and I just walked up to Ralph Stanley, who was the banjo player, and I said, "I got a banjo, and I don't know really much about what it is. It says Gibson, but I've never seen one like it before." And of course he tuned right into that, and his eyes narrowed. He looked at me and he said, "Well, where do you live?" And I said, Summersville. He said, we're going right through there on the way to Charleston. He said, could we stop and look at it? And here was Ralph and Carter Stanley. Of course you can stop at the house. We'd love to have you stop at the house. What an honor, you know. Stop at the house and look at it. So they stopped, and I brought the banjo out. He opened up the trunk of his car, and he looked at it for a second. He said, oh, it's just one of the old cheap banjos that Gibson made. He said, nobody plays them much anymore. You know. Then he said, what do you want for it? And I told him, I said, well, it's not for sale. I can't. It's the only one I've got. You know, I can't sell it. I just want to know what it is. And with that, he put it back in the case, handed it to me, slammed his trunk down, got in the car, and drove off. Melvin Goins, who I ended up working with for several years, and who came here as one of our guest artists a few years back, told me years later, he said, he cussed you all the way to Charleston. But he wanted that banjo. And it turns out that banjo, I know where the banjo is. There's a guy in Parkersburg that has that banjo. And it turns out that the banjo was actually worth a good deal more than the one I traded for it. But I didn't know that. And Dad didn't. None of us knew that. You know. So the original banjo ended up in several people's hands. I actually had it back at one point. And then I don't know what the series of trades were, but I think I ended up making over $600 on that banjo over a period of 10 years. But the original banjo is long gone. Wish I had it back though. Those were good banjos, and I didn't realize it at the time. I mean, I thought it was a good banjo, but I didn't realize how good it was. Had a lot of pre-World War II parts in it. You know, that Gibson has just had in there. You know, they just go back on the shelf and grab a wooden rim and a tone ring and throw them together, and that's what they made. But those things were there since before World War II. So,
yes.
You know, and because of World War II and because of some of the laws governing imports of metal and wood, you know, they couldn't replace those. They couldn't get them. But that first banjo's long gone.
Okay, so you're, as you mentioned a little bit ago, your father was performing for a good period, and you said your mother came along later.
Yeah, they were probably both playing guitar and singing long before they were married, long before they met. I think that's part of the glue that kept them together. But
I mean, actually going out and performing though.
After they were married.
Yes.
Yeah, they really never did.
Okay.
They played around the house pretty much, but I think what it was when they realized, okay, we've got a family here, and we got musicians in this family. Let's use them. Let's do something with it. And bluegrass music was getting to be really popular by that time. So, you know, here's this family that you got a built-in band, and Dad was a great singer. Mother was too. I mean, they were just great singers. I mean, they were. They appeared on Prairie Home Companion. You know, they appeared on the Wheeling Jamboree. They appeared on a lot after all this. You know.
What years would have that have been?
Oh, recently.
Okay.
Like in the 90s.
I see.
In the 90s. You know, after I was grown up, you know, and gone, and we still performed. But they pretty much sang at home. That's what they did. I don't recall any church affiliation musically. There was actually no church affiliation at all in our family. I think everybody believed in God. They just didn't believe in churches. You know, pretty much is what it amounted to, and that's carried on. You know, I'm pretty much the same way, but they really didn't start playing out and playing professionally until I did. And so they might have played on they might have played for a pie social or something at one of the schools one time or another. My sisters, older sisters, they had a trio that sang with one of the neighbor ladies, and so they performed on TV and radio a few times. Dad would take them out to do that, but that didn't last very long, maybe a couple years, and that would have been in the early 50s. But by that time they were of marrying age, and anything to get off the farm. So they both got married and left the farm. So it'd be hard to say. I'd say Mom and Dad they didn't start playing semi-professionally until I did.
Okay. I know you've mentioned before that I guess maybe some of your earliest gigs would have been square dances. Is that
Square dances?
safe to say?
Yeah, one of the local people there in Nicholas County was Rush Butcher, who just passed away last year, as a matter of fact. And Rush held square dances 2 or 3 times a year, and he would always call us because we always had somebody who played fiddle in the band, and so he would call us and we'd go play music for the square dances, and he had recorded music that he used as well. But people always wanted to square dance, so we'd go play for the square dances.
And how old were you? You think it would have been when that started?
I was 14 when I started playing banjo, so it would have been after that. It would have been certainly probably while I was 15.
Okay.
I'd say. I was a freshman in high school, so. And then it seems like I did work for Rush for years, counselor in some of his camps, and I'll never forget, he hired me one time to be the string instructor in his summer camps. That was until the boy he hired to wash dishes broke his foot, and he shifted me quickly over to the kitchen duty. So I had to wash dishes for 2 weeks. And he said, we got to get these things done.
It's priorities.
Yeah, priorities first. You can do that stuff later, but we got to get these dishes cleaned.
You have also, if you want to share this, it's fine. If not, I understand. You have mentioned before that there was some small controversy around that time period early on when you first started playing semi-professionally and actually getting some gigs regarding. You told me a story about a church.
Oh, I'll be glad to tell you that
Okay.
story. I was excommunicated. I always call it that. Catholics don't like for you to use those terms, but the minister, the local Baptist church, stopped me on the street one day. This was in Braxton County.
Okay.
In fact, I think I was I in college by that time? I think I was. I think I was already in college. But he stopped me on the street, or in fact called me across the street. Hey, buddy, hey, come over here. And I walked over, and he put his arm in, and he said, now, do your family play for square dances? Boy, he's really excited about this. I said, yeah, sure do. And boy, he just flipped just like that to the fire and brimstone, and just flat out told me I was going to hell for that. And I never went back to his church, ever again, and was glad not to go back. But yeah, that actually happened, and we'll hold the names to protect the innocent.
Yes.
Of course, my name, so it wouldn't be hard to look the rest of it up. But a few years later, my brother-in-law, we both got a letter from that church, saying they'd taken our names off the rolls because we weren't, I guess we weren't kind of people they wanted, on their rolls.
Do you think that sort of opinion was rampant at the time?
Yeah, I think it was. I think certainly for that denomination, and while other denominations outright welcome you, so I don't know. It's really a shame that it's that way. I mean, that's, to me, he just might as well have said, you know, you can't do music for the rest of your life if you're going to be here. Because I was already playing fiddle, you know, and banjo and singing. And I thought, now wait just a minute here. You know, I don't remember reading this anywhere. You know, but at the same time, you know, people had their views about that kind of stuff. So, yeah, he kicked me out.
Well, so let's move on to when you graduated high school. Is that correct?
Well, yeah.
Yes. Where at?
Yeah, in Braxton County.
Braxton County?
Actually, Sutton. Braxton County High School came along a couple years later. But they'd already started building the new consolidated high school when I graduated, but I graduated Sutton.
Okay.
109 people in the class. I always tell people I was in the top 95% of that class. And I was, by the hardest probably. But yeah, graduated and immediately came here in the fall.
What do you think, I mean, at that time, there probably wasn't a high percentage of people going to college, at least your age group, or possibly there was.
Or my background, probably.
What do you think, I mean, when did you decide that you were going to go to college?
It was decided in probably two different ways. At that time, the Vietnam War was going on. So you had to choose, if you did not go to college, you were going to be drafted. That was just the way it worked. And some of my good friends were drafted right after high school and did not come back, you know. And so I understand the situation. So I came to college and thought, you know, there's got to be a better way. You know, I wasn't against the war. I never was. You know, and a lot of people, of course, are now. In hindsight, you can be against things. But I think the general psyche of the country at that time was, we have to do something about communism, and this is the only way we know how. You know, we fight and kill people. Well, I didn't want to fight and kill people. You know, my question at that time was, well, what else is there to do? You know, but anyway, while I was, and it might have been just out of just pure stupidity too, but I certainly wasn't against the war, but I was against getting shot at, you know, and so I looked at college as a way to at least put that off for a while, and maybe by that time the war would be over.
Did you look at anywhere else other than Glenville?
I couldn't afford to. If it had not been for Glenville State College, and while this is not a glowing, you know, endorsement of everything Glenville ever did, but if it had not been for Glenville State College, I couldn't have gone to college. I couldn't have afforded to go to college.
How did you pay?
I worked 3 jobs at the time and borrowed $1,000 a year on the federal student, you know, the federally insured student loan program. And then played music whenever I could to make a few extra bucks. So actually I worked in the library.
Right here in this building?
Yeah, right here. I was circulation guy downstairs.
It was fairly new at that time.
I think it had been built in, what, 63 or 4?
64, 65.
Around in there someplace. And so I started in 67, so yeah, it was pretty new, pretty new library. David Gillespie was the librarian at the time. And I don't know what he saw in me, but he hired me. You know.
Is this the first place you pursued work on campus?
First place on campus.
Okay.
Off campus, I worked in the local Esso gasoline station, which was the log cabin, which is now parked out at Cedar Creek, I think. But it was down on the corner across from Gomart, where the Sunoco is.
Yes.
And so a good friend of mine, Harless Turner, whom I met through musicians that I knew, Harless got me a job down there, you know, working on the weekends and some evenings, you know, and so I worked there all through school, you know, all 4 years.
And correct me if I'm mistaken, was your first visit to campus actually during the folk festival?
That was in 1966.
Okay.
Yeah, and the first time I came to Glenville was in 1966 at the folk festival, and the guy who played fiddle with us came over to the house and said, "Come and go with me." He said, "I'm going to go over to Glenville," and he said, "There's a banjo and a fiddle contest." He said, "Who knows, you might win some money." Well, neither of us knew that they didn't give money for prizes. But I showed up, and David Morris was the MC for the contests that day, and they were held right there in the old amphitheater. And so I'm sitting backstage with my bluegrass picks on, sitting there playing, and Dave come back and he said, "Well, you're a pretty good banjo player." He said, "But you can't use those picks on the contest." He said, we only do old time." And I said, "I don't know how to play that." And he took my banjo and he showed me. He said, "Do it this way." And so I did. I won second place.
First time you'd ever played without?
First time I'd ever played without my bluegrass picks. But I just kind of strummed the banjo and played a couple tunes I knew, old-timey tunes. And so I credit David with that one, and
that rule, I guess, would have been to...
Well, the folk festival itself was designed to preserve the music as we knew it here in Appalachia before recorded music, before radio, before all that stuff got a firm hold on the population. And so there were a lot of tunes and a lot of songs, a lot of melodies that had just gotten here to the mountains and hadn't changed. And then when everybody got a radio or a phonograph, they heard styles from other places, and it just kind of got it all mixed up, and so nobody knew really what was authentic at that time. So the effort was to preserve that pre-recorded, pre-mass communication sound of the banjos and the fiddles and the singing. And so, and I didn't know that. I knew it then, I found out then. And I've always supported the folk festival.
Do you think you attended every year after that?
No, I didn't. As a matter of fact, I didn't attend even when I was in college here. The first year after college, like I started in '67, and the summer of '68, I worked in Braxton County at a gas station all summer, 40 hours a week. And so wouldn't have had time to come back to the folk festival. Knew it existed, but didn't have time to come. And I think the first year that I got involved, not even involved in the folk festival, but caught part of it, was '69. And then, of course, in '70, I think in '70 or '71, I actually played in the fiddle contest. Got nowhere, but I played in the contest. So I really didn't start attending the festival until '71 or '2, but knew it was here all along, and I always thought it was neat, because I'd go to summer school. After that, like in '69, I think I went 2 summers in summer school, 69 and 70, well, 3 in '71. So I was here during the folk festival, and I'd be in English class to Dr. Miller, S.B. Miller, and I'd hear fiddles out in the lawn up here. And he'd always open the windows so we could hear the music, It was great. It was just wonderful. So one time a year, Glenville became, a music school, because you just listen to that stuff and learn it. It was great fun. But after that, I was a pretty regular.
With that initial impression that you got upon visiting.
Yeah, I thought that's what Glenville was all about, And again, I was a bluegrass player, but by that time I knew the difference, and I just thought it was wonderful. Fiddle, in fact, just the old time fiddling that I would hear here at the festival, really probably hit me as hard as the banjo did when I heard those Scruggs play the Beverly Hillbillies.
When did you actually start focusing on the fiddle a good bit more?
You always just pick up an instrument or two now and then and hit a lick on it, I didn't really start focusing on the fiddle until I got out of college. because my plans were finish college, get my degree, and we'll see where everything was at that time. Of course, we had the lottery by that time, the draft lottery, and I had a pretty low number. So I taught school for a couple years, and that was another deferment for a couple years. After the second year teaching school, after the first year teaching school, I got a notification from the draft board that my number was coming up in August. And so I thought, well, this is it. I'm going to have to go. And so I was out playing music somewhere one weekend in late June up in Ohio someplace. And just happened to be at somebody's house and the TV was on. And that was the night that Congress ended the draft law. And so I'm sitting there thinking, what was that again? Does this mean I don't have to go back to teaching? And I didn't. I left teaching.
Were you always a commuter while you were here?
No, I commuted for 1 year. I stayed in the dormitory for one semester. Well, we did quarters at that time. Each semester had 2 quarters. Okay. And you actually took those classes, it seems like 5 days a week. I can't remember exactly how it was. Some of them 3 days a week, something like that. But I lived in the dormitory just long enough to know that I didn't want to live in the dormitory. That was a semester, and by the 4th quarter of that year, I just said, no, I'm gonna commute. Sutton was only 25 miles away, and I had a couple of friends that drove back and forth as well. So we shared
some carpooling.
Yeah, did some carpooling, and then when I came back, I lived off campus.
Did you pursue the same degree the entire time?
Language arts, yeah. Okay. At the end of the 4 years, I switched from language arts to English and history. Give me a little bit better chance there of finding a job teaching, And besides, I'd flunked a couple of play production classes, and so I didn't want to have to take those over again. And I thought, well, and I thought, well, if I have to do that, I'm going to have to be here for another semester. And so the easy thing to do, which I did, was to switch from English to history, because English was already done. And I'd already had all the journalism classes for the language arts degree. So I just had to take one class through the summer, which was a history class that I hadn't had. And so I graduated with English and history.
Okay. What were some things that you were involved in here on campus?
Radio. From the time I got here, I don't know what it was. I was always interested in radio, always, from the time I was a little kid. And so from the time I got here, I thought, boy, it'd be great to have a radio station here on campus. A lot of colleges have them, And so I forget now exactly how all this happened, but Ralph Bain, you remember him, retired a few years back, was pretty new on campus. He was into science, and I really enjoyed his classes. And I was talking to him one day about it. Somehow it was physical science, they called it then, and somehow we got to talking about radio waves, and I just said, why don't they have a radio station here? And he just looked at me and he said, well, let's start one. And so he knew the procedure. We started a club, got several people involved in the club. Then we started working on this angle of it and that angle of it. And so that was in '67. By late '68 or early '69, we were on the air. And stayed on the air for pretty close 20 years. But what we did, they assigned us a room. you know where the cafeteria is,
Mhm.
in the Mullahan Center now. We
It
were
would have just been
on,
the student union at that point, or the Pioneer Center?
it was, the student union was upstairs on the 3rd floor where Jerry Burkhammer's office is.
Okay.
Pioneer Center is what it's called. 2nd floor had the cafeteria, had, which was called the Verona Maple Room, I think, at one time. And then on this end of the building was another cafeteria, another place that they would see kids to eat. But beside that was called a multi-purpose room. And the multi-purpose room was just like this. In fact, it looked down this way. It's where that open area is where the offices are now, beside the cafeteria. But the strange thing about it was there was a room right here after you come up the stairs.
Mhm.
Had a big glass window in it, and there was another big room out here that had curtain, you know, one of those pull curtains that you could separate the room, so we could actually have 3 studio hookups.
I see.
So we built the control room in that small booth with the glass window, and it actually had the building. It had a big old music. Had a radio, and it had the system where, you know, where they could play stuff over the speakers all over the building.
Mhm.
And so they put us in that room, and we had turntables. We had a radio studio is what it was. In fact, there are pictures in the old Mercury of that. And then we used the big room as, you know, if we wanted to have groups to come in and perform, or somebody wanted to do radio drama, we could do that. And so that's pretty much how we did it. But we actually went on the air first on the local TV cable on Channel 1, or Channel 2 maybe.
Mhm.
And we actually broadcast ball games. You know, the telephone company gave us a hookup from the football field, which was over in Brooklyn
Mhm.
at the time, and one from the gymnasium. And so we could do remote broadcasts of the ball games. That was a big thing. We could do a lot of that. Actually went to Charleston and did the state tournaments for the first time in the spring of 1969. We'd go to all the games, you know, that are played locally. Fairmont, Alderson brought us, or Tech, or somebody like that, or Morris Harvey, which is University of Charleston now.
Mhm.
And so we broadcast a lot of ball games, did a lot of music, did a lot of, I think we did a few phone-in things to raise money, you know, that kind of thing. So we were doing that. And then after we did all that, we actually had some carrier current transmitters made for each building. And of course, the wires were already in place. You know, you could just run it on the telephone line from the Pioneer Center over to the AB building, to the gym, to the dormitories. And so we had a feed into every building. And the little transmitter was about this big, and it actually used the electric lines in the building as an antenna.
Okay.
So as long as you were inside the building with your radio, AM radio, so there was a hum in it, as long as you were inside the building, you pick it up. Now, I'll never forget, we were 640 on the dial on the AM radio, but it stayed that way for 20 years. And I think eventually they looked into getting an FM station, you know, like a low power.
Mm-hmm.
And I think by the time they got to that point, other things were happening, and a former president shut it down. So, yeah, radio was probably the biggest thing I got involved in here.
You were also involved with the student newspaper at one point?
Just because I was a journalism student, but I think I worked one summer as a circulation manager which meant that I carried papers out and put them in places around the campus, and I didn't really have anything to do. But
Did you write any articles or anything?
I wrote a few articles, but wouldn't have any idea what they were about now, and not much. I mean, most of the articles were handled by the people who were actually journalism majors.
Mm-hmm.
And I was an English major, but had to take journalism
Yes.
because of the language arts function. So I only wrote a couple articles that I remember, and honestly don't remember what they were about.
Did you have any music courses or music-related courses during that time period?
Funny you asked that question. When I came back here, it was kind of ironic because I came back to teach the strings class. Now, by that time, we did not have an orchestra. You know, the music education kids were required to take a class instruction in strings. You know, they had to learn about all the stringed instruments and had to play with a little bit of proficiency on some of them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so John McKinney actually hired me to come back and adjunct the strings class. But while I was here, he had other plans, you know. But the ironic thing about it was, I took a string class. I thought, you know, I wanted to learn to play fiddle. So I took a string class, actually a private lesson, to Mrs. Olson, Bertha Olson, who was not what you would call a big fan of hillbilly fiddling.
Uh-huh.
So I went to the class. She just gave me a piece of music and said, "Okay, this is what you're going to be working on this week." Well, I ended up 2 pieces for the entire semester, and I couldn't play either one of them. For my jury, one of the other musicians who was actually in the orchestra
Mm-hmm.
and played violin, he would play the pieces for me, and I would learn them by ear. And I'd go back in and I'd play them, and I couldn't read the music. I just couldn't read it, you know, and couldn't have translated it to the fiddle anyway if I could have read it. So, but she caught on pretty quickly, and she, you know, took me in for the jury at the end of the semester, and she was fully intent upon flunking me for the semester.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because I was just a transient, you know, I was not a music major, and I was just in there just to see if I could do it, you know, and wanted to learn something from it. And Gary Gillespie was one of the faculty members who was part of my jury.
And this would have been probably typical classical type.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I could already play fiddle tunes.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew a bunch of fiddle tunes by that time. I wasn't good, but I knew them, and I knew that. So I played the assigned piece, and as I was tucking my tail between my legs and dashing out of the glad to get out of there, Gary Gillespie just yelled after me. He said, "Wait a minute, buddy." He said, "Wait a second here," and he said, "Come back in here." And he said, "You're from Braxton County." He said, "I know your family well." He said, "You all play a lot of music." He said, "Do you play any fiddle tunes? You know some fiddle tunes you can play for us?" And I thought, am I hearing this right? Because I'd had him in music appreciation that same year. And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Sure I can." He said, "Well, play us a couple." So I think the first one he asked me for was Turkey in the Straw. And I knew it, you know, so I played that. Of course, they're sitting there, you know, doing this, you know, just having a great time. It was him and Ed Vineyard, and I forget who the other one was. And Mrs. Olson, of course, maintaining her composure through all of this. And then they said, "Well, just play one that's your favorite." I forget what it was. It was probably Ragtime Annie or some D tune. That's the easiest thing to play in. I played another one. Of course, they're just having a big time there. I should have flunked that class, but I got a C. And I'll never forget Gary Gillespie for pulling me out of the drink on that one.
Uh-huh.
He knew, he knew, wait a second, you're not getting a fair shake here, we know you do, we know what you can do, and so he was very kind. Yeah, but then I came back to teach the string class, and the ironic part about it, John McKinney put me in the office. There were 2 huge grand pianos in there, in the big office where Teresa Doty is now.
Mm-hmm.
And John said, well, you should enjoy this office, especially late at night. And I said, why is that? He said, that piano right there was the one Bertha Olson almost flunked you in the string class. That's the one she played in her office.
Uh-huh.
So there were nights I'd walk in and I'd just kind of look in to see if there was anything going on,
Uh-huh.
But that I thought was ironic. And I'm sure Bertha, had she known, she would have shuddered in her grave, to think that I was teaching that string class. But I had learned to play since then, so, and could read a little bit, so it all worked out.
Uh-huh. Well, I know you had an engagement.
You want to stop here? Is that clock right?
Yes.
Yeah, I probably ought to.
Okay, and so we'll leave off today. Pretty much we're stopping at the point to where you graduated college.
Yep.
We touched base a little bit further on that, but I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a good stopping point, and we'll pick up another time, sir.
Tomorrow?
Yes.
Okay.
Today is March 22nd, 2012. We are reconvening with Mr. Buddy Griffin here at Glenville State
This
College
sounds legal.
at the Robert F. Kidd Library.
Reconvene. Court's in session.
Okay.
Go with the questions.
Yesterday, basically, we just stopped at, you were kind of finishing up college. Were you still living with your parents at that point?
No, I hadn't lived with my parents. Parents, that's always a stopping off place.
Uh-huh.
When I left to go to college, I pretty much left home. Mm-hmm. And except for just, the usual 2 or 3 week foray, of coming back home to visit and that kind of thing. But we played music a lot, and so I stayed there a lot. I actually did come back twice and spent time at home. One when I took a teaching job until I found a place, and then another time when Mom and Dad were both getting a little older, and I actually left what I was doing in Arkansas, sold the house and came back and just kind of moved in with them, and we found a house big enough for all of us, and so that's pretty much the way it was until Mom passed away. And then 6 months after Mom passed away, Dad went to the nursing home anyway. So, I guess you could say I actually lived at home, later in life too. Mm-hmm. Either that or they lived in my house. I don't know how that went, but uh-huh. it was something like that. But no, from college on, I was pretty much, at the end of high school, I was pretty much out on my own.
Okay.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that not long after college you began teaching.
I had no intention of teaching, actually. And there's a strange story that goes with this. I had decided that I really wanted to do music. Mm-hmm. And so I had really no intention of teaching. And I got a phone call from somebody, like the latter part of August, first week of September maybe, whenever it's about the time school started. First day of school, a teacher in Nicholas County was killed in an automobile accident, and she was the English teacher for the 7th and 8th grade, the junior high. And so a friend called and said, we really need a teacher down here. Would you be interested? And they told me what the situation was, and I said, well, I'd be glad to come and do it until you can find somebody,
And at that time, you went through student teaching and...
Oh, yeah. In fact, I'd finished student teaching that spring, and had gone to summer school for at least half of the summer to pick up a history class that I needed to finish my English and history degree. And but anyway, I had finished classes and was headed out. I didn't care where. I I'm free of college. I was out of there, And so a friend called and said that this lady had been killed in an automobile accident, and could I come and take the job? But I told them I would until they found somebody. Well, it took them 2 years, and they still hadn't found anybody. And so I didn't want to pass up opportunities for music. And so
things were coming along at that point. I mean,
I was playing every weekend.
Mm-hmm.
Every weekend. I came in one Monday morning, and I had a study hall the first thing in the morning. And I remember calling the roll down to about F or G. Then the next thing I knew, my head hit the desk. I went to sleep.
Uh-huh.
And of course, I never lived that down. Not at that school anyway. But
where were some of these first
this
gigs?
was Nicholas County.
Nicholas County, okay.
Oh, where were the first gigs that I
these
played?
gigs coming together at that point.
I don't. Music gigs were just anywhere and everywhere. Mostly regionally.
Uh-huh.
Some in Virginia, some in Ohio, some in West Virginia. So it was just wherever somebody needed somebody to play.
Were you marketing yourself at that point, or was it mostly word of mouth?
I was not. A friend of mine that I'd gone to high school with was a year behind me here at college. His name was George Ward, and George was and still is a very talented guitar player and singer. And so he and I were dabbling around as a duo, and then we had bands that, there were people that we'd get together as a band. And so we were playing some together at that time. But I would kind of just go out with, whoever needed a fiddler or a banjo player, I'd go do it. And so that was actually starting to fill up quite a bit, and I was doing almost every weekend I was out playing somewhere. And so it was actually interfering with my teaching. So, and I knew it, But I did this for 2 years, and then I had signed on with a group from Elkins. It was a family band, and the name of the band was the Heckles. And they were, by that time, early 70s, this would have been 73. And they asked if I'd like to join them, and play with them pretty much full time. The girls were still in school; they were still in high school. The older girl was about 17 or 18, and the younger girl was 14 or 15. So they were still in school, and so, but they were very good. And I went up to the Wheeling Jamboree with them like a couple of weeks after I started playing with them, and the Jamboree was big time then. It was owned by Screen Gems. And so I walked in, and the guitar player, who was the regular staff guitar player on the Jamboree and still is up in that area, was somebody I'd known from childhood. He had come around and played in places that my mom and dad and I had played. And he said, "I know you." And I said, "Yeah, you look familiar," because I hadn't seen him in, probably 5-6 years. And of course, teenagers grow up. And it turned out it was Roger Horde, and his family was from Braxton County as well. And so before I knew it, the management of the Jamboree came down, the director of the Jamboree came down and said, "How would you like to come work with us up here?" And I said, "I'd love it." So I called, this was in actually April of 73. And so I didn't even have to think it over. I thought, yeah, I'm going to do this. And so I called the school, called the assistant principal at the high school, and I said, "Mr. Bailey, do you suppose you could get somebody to fill in for me for the rest of the year if I resigned? And he said, we'd be glad to. I'll never forget the tone of his voice. Why, we'd be happy to do that. So, but anyhow, that's.
So this job was located, the Jamboree job?
Jamboree was in Wheeling.
Wheeling.
Yeah. And so I had to move up there.
Uh-huh.
You know, I actually lived in Moundsville. But that was not long lived. And the reason, you know, you always think, well, there's this opportunity to make a lot of money here. No, there was no money. I mean, there was money, but it wasn't enough to sustain you. I mean, you had to actually do something else during the day or during the week. Mm-hmm. And so I managed from April to November. And I thought, you know, Jamboree or no Jamboree, you know, I'm going to have to get out of here and work. And just fortunately, there was a guy who was on the Jamboree, drove up from Cincinnati. His name was Landon Williams, and Landon was just one of those tall, good-looking guys, you know, and he could sing. Boy, great singer, still is. I see him occasionally, and he came to me at the Jamboree, and he said, how would you like to make more money than you've ever seen? And I said, well, you've got my interest. Now, what would I be doing? He said, playing fiddle and banjo with me in Cincinnati. And I said, well, what do you do down there? He said, I have a nightclub. And I wasn't really I didn't drink, you know, so I thought, well, I'll tell you what, I'll come down and look it over. So I drove, he hired the bass player who was playing at the Jamboree and me at the same time. So we drove down and, you know, just met up at the club, and those guys could sing. And they sang the kind of music that I knew. I mean, I understood it, you know. And so that was around the end of October. And so 1st November, I grabbed up stakes and moved to Cincinnati and started working with him. And it was better money than I'd made teaching school, you know, no benefits. Mm-hmm. You know, when you're 23 or 24 years old, you don't think about that stuff. But anyway, later on, some years later, I actually went back to the Jamboree and as actually a full-fledged member of the Jamboree, entertaining. Mm-hmm. And that was George Ward and me. George also graduated here, by the way. But anyhow, that's from the teaching job. And I think I told you that the teaching job, I got that because this lady was killed in an automobile accident the first day of school. Mm-hmm. And I actually had her daughter in class, and who had been riding in the vehicle when the accident happened. But about 10 years later, a little less than 10 years, maybe 9 years later, I got a call from my sister who was teaching in Braxton County. And at that time I was working in Lexington, Kentucky. My sister said, would you be interested in a teaching job? And the things were about to shut down in Lexington anyway. And I said, well, teaching what? Well, I don't know yet, but I'm sure they'd work it around to get you in here. And so I went to see the superintendent. And I said, well, yeah, I'm interested in doing it as long as it's what I want to teach. Mm-hmm. He said, well, what do you want to teach? I'll give you a choice. What do you want to teach? He said, do you want to teach phys ed or do you want to teach history? And I said, well, my degree's in history, or my minor's history. He said, let me see what I can do. And I didn't realize it at the time, but one of the teachers had been killed the first day of school in an automobile accident. I mean, how weird can this be? Mm-hmm. And so what he ended up doing was shifting whoever was teaching social studies at the Gasaway Middle School to teach phys ed, health phys ed at one of the elementary schools, and hired me to teach social studies at the elementary school. So, or at the middle school.
Had your sister been a graduate at here also?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, she was a music ed person.
Okay.
And so both times that I taught public school was because somebody had been killed in an automobile accident. Now, the kicker of this is, some years later, after I was actually living in Branson, or in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, which is just across the border from Branson, and I was headed back home to do something, and I can't remember now what it was. This would have been in the early 90s, probably 94, 95, around in there. And my car broke down, and turned out that it was an alternator or something like that. So I stopped at a little gas station out on Route 32, east of Cincinnati. And there was an old guy sitting there, and we got started talking. He was from North Carolina, and I said, "Well, I'm from West Virginia. I'm headed back there to do whatever I was doing. I can't remember now what it was." And he said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "I had some relatives that lived in West Virginia." And I said, "Well, where?" "Summersville." And that's where I taught the first year. And I said, "Well, and are you from there?" And he said, "No." I said, "I just want to go up to visit once in a while." And he said, "My sister was a school teacher there." And it just kept going and kept going. And I said, "Well, what was her name?" And he told me what her name was. And I just looked at him and I said, "When she was killed in her automobile accident, I replaced her." Because he had told me the story, you know. And how weird can that be?
Yes.
I mean, it's her brother, and I always thought, fate, you never really know. Never really know. But that was just such an odd thing to happen. And he had broken down, and he was there waiting for these people to fix his car,
Almost a string theory type thing.
Yeah. I mean, it always amazes me that meeting took place right there when it did. Well, I think I remember now. I was actually playing with a group back around here, just so I could be back a little closer to Mom and Dad's. But I was still living in Arkansas at the time. A couple years later, sold the house and moved back. But it was, there's a lot of in-between stuff there that we didn't talk about. But as far as teaching was concerned, I didn't teach again until I came here in 97. Actually, I didn't start teaching until 99 here. They had approached me about doing the string class. And to be frank, I said, under the administration, the current administration you have, I wouldn't even consider it. Call me if anything changes.
And that would have been you said mid-90s or?
Yeah, that would have been 97, 98, around in there. And then, of course, there was a change in command here at Glenville.
Yes.
Right about that time, and they called and said, "Well, things have changed." And I said, "When do I report?" So I came back after all that and taught.
Would have been would have Dr. Flack been here during that period?
Dr. Flack was actually in the presidency, yeah. Like the day he took the position, they called me and said, "Do you want to do it now?" I said, "I'll do it." And I had actually just started. I had just taken a position playing with Jim and Jesse at the Grand Ole Opry. And so I told Mr. McKinney, who was chairman.
McReynolds, is that correct?
Yeah, Jim and Jesse McReynolds. But professionally, they were just known as Jim and Jesse.
Okay.
But I told Mr. McKinney, I said, "Well, I don't think I can do it now because I've taken this job." He said, "Yeah, you can." He said, the class just meets 2 times a week, Monday and Wednesday." He said, "You can do that." And so I thought it over, and I said, "Okay, I can do that." So I did, and until I retired last year.
So basically, from the time you graduated up until you started here,
Mhm.
You'd only taught in 2 different schools,
Mhm.
and the rest of the time you were basically going out and pursuing your.
I was in some form of the arts, yeah. Um, the only other thing that I did, really, other than as far as an employment position, I worked 3 years with the Department of Culture and History as director of the Camp Washington Carver Division of Culture and History.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was director of that from '84 to '86. And I considered that pretty much an arts job, a music job anyway, although I was actually an administrator at the time, but I was involved in music a lot at the time. So I really didn't consider that as it's not entertainment, it was just a means to an end, I guess.
Were you able to make some connections during that period of time too in the state?
Yeah,
state
I mean,
history?
whether you want to or not, you make connections.
Yes.
But it's oftentimes the connections you want to make you can't make.
Mm-hmm.
But after culture and history, which actually ended at the end of the year in '86. But after culture and history, I actually decided if I'm, because I'd already passed 30, so I thought if I'm going to make music something that's a valid means of support, then I'm going to have to do more than just go out and play gigs. And of course I knew that all along. So when I left culture and history, I actually started a publishing company and a record label, which I so neatly called Braxton, because I called the record company Braxton Records, mm-hmm. and the publishing company Granny's Creek Publishing Company, and these are still viable entities, and so I'd had so much experience recording over the years, and I thought, one of the things that I really need to do is make recording available to people who ordinarily would not have had the opportunity to record.
Okay.
And so I actually did a recording myself, mm-hmm. and then the next thing that I actually ended up recording was one of my mom and dad, because they were just so talented. They'd recorded some before, a few years before, but it really didn't amount to anything. And then I just decided, okay, we're going to record something, of you all, and then that's probably the best-selling thing I ever did, because we sold a lot of those. Mm-hmm. They were just cassette tapes at the time, and then I was coming back.
Where were you selling some of your materials out of? Did
you have
third parties or? Yeah,
we used to go out and play gigs, and there's a big misconception about record sales and CD sales for artists. In our genre, in bluegrass and old time music, if you're gonna sell records, it's up to you to sell them. That's why you don't see any people like us on major labels, because they can't sell enough of them. We're too regional. But as far as we're concerned, we sell more records than the record company could if they did sign us on. So signing up to a record label is not really a big option for people like me or people like the people I play with.
Mm-hmm. You better promoting yourself, basically.
Well, you have to. Mm-hmm. I mean, you have to do that. But anyhow, after the CD, not the CD, but the cassette tape actually that I made of myself, and then the one of Mom and Dad, I approached Mac Samples, and he and his brothers had played together for years, and I joined them and played a lot of things with them. Mm-hmm. And so I talked them into recording some. and it would be a close. I mean, I'm still getting checks from Mac. You know, this is 2013, and we recorded that in 1989, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it really has been a nice surprise. You know, every once in a while you get a check for $100, or you get a check for this or that.
Uh-huh.
You know, sometimes it's been $400 or $500, but from several people that you've recorded, and I would just record them and then turn it over to them. I mean, they'd be the ones who would get you know, mass produce it and sell it,
Mm-hmm.
and so it actually worked out pretty well. You know.
I'm sure there's also, you know, hundreds of different individuals that you've worked with over your career. One person I was going to ask you about would that have been about the time that you had done some shows with George, the Earl of Elkview?
I met George in 1970,
Okay.
and George Ward, and we were still in college.
Uh-huh.
George Ward and I had hooked up with a couple other guys. One was Alan Morris, who was from Clay County.
Okay.
Alan still is a great singer. In fact, Alan came up here when we did the Mayberry shows.
Is that the relation of David Morris?
No,
No.
no, but same county, but not a relation. Different end of the county. But Alan came up as Ernest T. Bass when we did those shows, and he's just a great comic character.
Yes.
And so I see Alan every once in a while. He's still playing, still performing, but we hooked up with Alan, and so it was George, me, and Alan, and somebody who was putting on some sort of a program in Charleston. It was in the Charleston National Bank Plaza, and they asked if we could come through Clay County on the way down and pick up not Ira Mullins, Lee Triplett, who was an old-time fiddler and a legend here at the Folk Festival. So we drove down and picked Lee up and drove him to Charleston, and we got there, and I think maybe we performed 20 minutes, half an hour, and George was the next one on the show.
And that's George
Doherty, yeah, the Earl of Elkview. He's the next one on the show, and he just asked me if I'd play with him. And I said, well, yeah, I'd be glad to. And we always say that started our world tour, you know, which is still going on.
Uh-huh.
We just did a concert St. Patrick's weekend this past year, and some of the kids in the bluegrass program here came down and helped us. But so I've known George since 1970. And a funny story, I went into his office. Not long after that, I was passing through Charleston, went into his office, and I walked into his office, and it was a room about the size of this area here, and it was just cluttered, just full of law books and junk, you know, things hanging on the wall, things sitting in the floor. I had to move stuff out of a seat to find a place to sit down, and I sat and talked to him that afternoon for a couple hours, and it finally dawned on me why his office was so cluttered with all those, you know, all those artifacts. Mm-hmm. Lawyers charge by the hour, and people look at this stuff and they're asking you questions. Oh, where'd you get this? You know, clock's running. You know, I've always accused him of that, but of course that was not the case. Yes. He didn't charge me anything, and he would never have done that to anybody. But I thought it was interesting that it was so cluttered in his office. Uh-huh. I mean, he could just barely find a path to get around in that office to go to his desk. Uh-huh. It was just so funny. But yeah, it's been a good relationship with George and me.
Okay, so that started a little earlier than I was aware.
Yeah, it goes way back. I was still in college when I met him. But over the years, you know, the different people, and actually I got reacquainted with David Morris about the same time, and David, is a classic entertainer, you know, very charismatic on stage, And, you know, he just had talent. It's just hard to believe so one person could command an audience like he could.
Mm-hmm.
And he still could, I suppose, if he wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
You know. But
So you actually met him prior to his Vietnam service, and then after.
I met him in '66,
Uh-huh.
and then got reacquainted in '70.
Okay.
Yeah, and I've had some experiences with Dave, to say the least.
Yes, George has been vocal with me
Yeah.
about some stories too. I'm not sure.
But I really don't know anybody who's any more talented. You know,
Mhm.
it's just amazing what he can do with the song, and still can. You know.
Okay. During this time period, you know, from the time you left this institution and then ended up, you know, back here, was there any relationships that brought you back here in the meantime for any reason?
Here at Glenville.
Yes. Yes.
Actually, there were. Max Samples probably would have been the key person in that. You know what? Until I came back here, let me just do a quick running chronology of what was going on.
Okay.
When I left here in '71, I taught school in Summersville, Nicholas County, until '73, and then worked the Wheeling Jamboree and the nightclub in Cincinnati until '75. And then at that point, I wanted to get away from playing electric music, and I haven't gone back. So, you know, I wanted to get away from that. So, since bluegrass music was actually, and old time music was the root music that that I've always played, I thought, well, I'll just see what I can kind of work I can land in bluegrass, because festivals were just really picking up, and so while I was still working in Cincinnati, I had gone down to Haddon, Kentucky, one night, and to visit some friends I'd met down there just while I was out playing, you know, and I saw a poster someplace, I forget now where I was even when I saw the poster, that the Goins brothers, who were West Virginia natives but were based in Kentucky at the time, Melvin and Ray Goins, were playing a concert at a local elementary school, which was actually in Haddon, Kentucky. And they were sharing the bill with Jim and Jesse McReynolds. And a good friend of mine that I'd learned a lot of fiddle from, Joe Meadows, was playing fiddle for them, just started playing fiddle for them. And this would have been in early '75, probably. About this time, about April, I'd say. And so I actually borrowed a fiddle from the lady that I was staying with, her and her husband, in Jackson, Kentucky. And so I borrowed a fiddle from her and went down. I thought, well, I'll get to see Joe, get to play a little fiddle with him, you know. And I walked in, and Joe said, Buddy, it's a good thing you came down. He said, Melvin Goins is looking for a fiddle player. Because Joe had worked with them too, and so he introduced me to Melvin, whom I'd met before, and Melvin wouldn't have remembered that, but he introduced us, and so I played a set on the fiddle with them that night, and they hired me. So I went straight from the nightclub business out to the festival circuit, you know, basically overnight. Mm-hmm. And so
And bluegrass festivals, that's a big thing in Ohio then and even now, is that correct?
Big thing everywhere.
Yeah.
I actually was fortunate. I went to the first ever bluegrass festival in Fincastle, Virginia in 1965. I had been playing banjo for 2 years. And so my dad and mom, the whole family, we just all went down to that bluegrass festival. We ended up going back the next year in '66. And so I got the opportunity to meet a lot of people and just see what it was all about. And at that time, I'm talking about 1965, at that time there was a small college near Roanoke, and I can't remember the name of the school even. I think it was in Highlands, Virginia. And I might have mentioned something about this yesterday, I can't remember.
I don't think so, not on tape, I don't believe.
Yeah. Well, anyway, that's where it was, down near Roanoke. And people were toying around with the idea of teaching bluegrass in a college. And I thought, boy, that's a great idea. Well, just shortly after that, I came here and saw all this fiddle music and things at the folk festival.
Yes.
And so, of course, the idea never occurred to me then that eventually one of these days we'd have a bluegrass program here, you know. But I figured, you know, a bunch of other colleges eventually did get programs. But when I came here, there was no degree. You couldn't go get a degree. So we kind of jumped the gun on everybody and upped the ante a little bit, you know, and we ended up getting the first degree here. But anyway, back to the 70s. Festivals had caught on and they were very popular. So I worked the festival circuit with Melvin off and on, and a band in Cincinnati called the Katie Lauer Band. And between the two bands, I had all the work I could do, and maybe more than I could do. But I eventually left the Goins brothers to devote most of my time to the Cincinnati band. And we were very popular. We traveled all over the Northeast, the Midwest, you know, west of the Mississippi some, but not much. But when we traveled all over the eastern United States for 3 or 4 years, and had become very popular, and actually were making some pretty serious money. And you know, for one reason or another, you decide, well, this still isn't just right for me. There wasn't enough organization in that conglomeration to suit me, because I was looking for, you know, something with a little bit of stability to it. And so by this time it was 78 or 79, and so shortly after that I actually came back to Braxton County and taught school. That was the second stint at public school teaching. So anyway, that got me through the 70s. From 79 to 82, I was teaching in Braxton County.
Castaway.
Yeah. And then I had, in the earlier days on the Jamboree, I had met Johnny Russell. Johnny was Big John Russell, they called him. I mean, he was a huge guy, between 300 and 400 pounds. I mean, he's just a big guy. And he was a very talented entertainer. He wrote Act Naturally that the Beatles and Buck Owens recorded. He wrote Making Plans that Porter Wagner and Dolly Parton recorded. You know, so he was a very well-known songwriter.
Had he recorded those tunes himself?
No, but he had hit songs with other songs that other people had written. Catfish John was a big hit song for him. Rednecks, White Sox, and Blue Ribbon Beer, that was another big hit song for him. And this was all in the early 70s. But anyway, I was about toward the end of the third year teaching in Braxton County, and he called me and asked me if I would be interested in working a theater on a regular basis with him in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. And I said, about this time of year when they contacted me, and I said, well, I don't know, what's it like out there? I'd never been to Eureka Springs, Arkansas. And so he thought for a long time. It was like a pause.
Yeah.
And he said, and I could just see him leaning back in his chair with his thumb like this, you know, and said, you like to fish? And I said, I love to fish. And he said, there's plenty of it out there. So I agreed to on spring break, you know, Easter break, that I would drive to Arkansas and visit Eureka Springs and see what I thought of it. And I actually drove out there, and at that time of year, nothing going on, no tourists, nothing. It's just a little town. And I decided at that time, nah, I don't think I want to do this. So I told him, I said, no, I don't think. He said, well, just do me this. He said, think about it. He said, I'll call you later after you had time to think about it. So I got a call from him in early May, and he was performing in Elkins at the college over there. And he said, come on over. He said, and talk to me about this. So I drove over, and he kind of had a show together, that he was going to be doing, and did some of his hits. And some of the people that I'd known from the Heckles group were playing with him. I thought, well, this might not be so bad, So at that point, I said, okay, I'll come out and do it for a summer. And I said, if I like it, I'll stay. If I don't like it, I'm coming back. And so this was in 1982. So I left school and actually went to summer school that summer while I was out in Eureka Springs, Arkansas. I had to renew my teaching certificate at the time. And so by the 4th of July, I had all that stuff finished, and so I really enjoyed the summer. I stayed there until the 1st of November in 82, and then came back to Cincinnati. And then 83 and early 84, I just kind of sort of hit around playing gigs around Cincinnati, and then took a job with Culture and History, 84 to 86. And after that, I just couldn't stand administration any longer, and I got out of that and went back to just basically what I'm doing now, and developed the record company and the publishing company, and ended up recording 8 or 10 artists here in West Virginia. The Samples Brothers, Mom and Dad, me, Bill Hairston. I don't know if you know Bill. Bill's also attended Glenville State College, but did not graduate here. Graduated at Marshall. So Old Time Fiddlers, Woody Simmons, some of those guys, and a few people who just wanted to record, and I didn't promote them. I just recorded them, But there's a lady who passed away a couple of years ago who was a good friend of George Doherty's and mine, named Bonnie Collins. And she was always here at the Folk Festival. And she told stories and wrote little songs and sang, and she was very nice, very funny. And so I recorded at least one CD of her. And then during the time between 86 and coming back here, I actually moved to Branson, took some jobs in theaters out there, worked with the Howard E. Brumley show. And Brumley's the one who wrote all those great gospel songs, I'll Fly Away. Now, I didn't work with him because he'd passed away by that time, but his sons. Al Brumley Jr. was he had in the early 60s had a TV show in Bakersfield, California. And he introduced Merle Haggard to the listening world, on his TV show.
Yes.
And so that was his claim to fame. His brother Tom played steel guitar with Buck Owens in the early 60s, and on all the big songs that he did, Together Again, Act Naturally, all that stuff. And then Tom worked with Ricky Nelson through the 70s, because there was a big resurgence of his career,
Nelson kind of reinvented himself at one point.
Yeah, well, he had to. He had to. It just it was one of those things. And I remember when Ricky Nelson's plane went down, I called Al and I said, Al, I heard about Ricky Nelson. He said Tom wasn't with him. It's because he knew why I was calling, and because Tom hadn't been in the band for 2 or 3 years at that point. But all these people who just had done everything you can imagine in country music, You know, it's just a great opportunity to get to perform with those people. And I worked in a show with Christy Lane, who was, I hope Christy never sees this, because she was just really one of the least talented people I ever worked with. You know, I mean, I wouldn't call her a musician. I would call her a produced star. They'd work with her in the studio. They'd have to edit tracks that she did. They'd have to track tracks that she did and tune them. You know, and
but that's probably happens more than
it happens.
people ever.
It happens more often than not. But that show paid very well. I actually played acoustic bass and a lot, and played fiddle and played banjo and guitar. It's kind of utility person, and had to wear a tux. But it was a fun show, and it was an interesting story about that show. The Blackwood Brothers Quartet sang on that show. This was in 1990. They sang on that show. And of course, here this quartet, but they have 5 people in the quartet.
Oh.
The quartet was singing, but the guy, Blackwood himself, wasn't really a good singer. And so he was out there just lip syncing with the rest of them, you know. The audience didn't know the difference. And so one night, the announcer, you know, we got the little vamp going that they would come out on stage to, you know, the music's already moving for the first song. And the announcer announced them, nobody came out. And the announcer announced them again, nobody came out. And so we just ended what we were doing, and the announcer said, "Well, we don't know what's happened, but we're going to move on with the show here." So quickly, the piano player started playing some instrumental, just got us past that. It turned out these guys had gotten into a fist fight backstage in the dressing rooms over money, you know, and they had to call the police. It was just so funny. Here's a gospel quartet just duking it out back there. And we were out there playing their music, and they didn't come out on stage. You know, so of all things to happen, you know, at a time like that. But we still had our tuxes on, and we finished the show. Yeah. You know.
They never did come out.
They never come out. No, then they never did come back to the show either. But it was kind of funny. But after that, I worked in a show in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, from 91 to 94. And that was called the Ozark Mountain Hoedown. And that was a great show. It was talented, funny comics. But it's like every other show, you know, they'd do pretty much what was hot on the country charts then. And they'd do a little segment of rock and roll, you know, some 50s rock and roll. They'd even do a few big band numbers, you know. And so it was a very popular show out there, and the pay was good, and the work was good until the owners, who were a husband and wife, divorced, and then the show got sold, and then it just went straight downhill. And I left just shortly after that. And I had started doing a radio program, which was taped in Arkansas, but was syndicated by the Fine Arts Network in Chicago. And so it's kind of like I moved from that show, you know, to live radio basically, and that lasted until '96, or maybe a little bit earlier, or no, later actually late '96, August of '96, and as a result of that show, though, I really lucked out because the Deering Banjo Company endorsed me. And I got their best banjo, a gold-plated Deering banjo. I mean, it's a nice banjo, you know.
Completely free.
Completely free, yeah. And and concurrently, I had in '95, I had gone back to play with Melvin Goins because his brother Ray, who played banjo, had a heart attack. And so I went back and played banjo with Melvin until he could find somebody, or until Ray would come back or whatever. Ray didn't come back, and in the next year, and boy, this is like third time's a charm, which would have been in '96. Melvin called me again, and he said, I need a fiddle player. And I said, well, how come, Melvin? And the boy playing fiddle with him had just driven out one Saturday morning with his cousin to go get a haircut. Coal truck just destroyed him. I mean, it's just tragic, really, really tragic thing. So I told him, I said, where are you playing this weekend? And he told me, and I said, I'll be there. So I drove out and ended up staying the whole season with him. Mm-hmm. And by that time, I was planning to come back here and do, John McKinney had contacted me, and I was planning to come back here in March or April and do a guest performance with the percussion ensemble. And so from that point on, this is where I've been.
Okay. You'd mentioned that there was possibly a few instances where Mac had brought you back to this campus.
Yeah, well, I think that's when I said, let me just do a chronology here. All through the from 1979, Mac contacted me and George Ward, not George Doherty.
Okay.
And wanted to know if we'd be interested in doing an artist in residence position here at the college. Didn't pay much, but it's just basically something to help promote what you're doing. So, but it was regular money, and that was great. So we came back in April. I think it was April. Signed the contracts, and I think it started the 1st of June. I think that's how it was. So just in time for the folk festival.
What year would that have been?
That was 79.
79, okay.
So our office, the college provided us an office, and that was up in the corner of the administration building in the basement, which was called the underground then, because that's where all the theater stuff was. But our office was where the security office is,
Okay.
campus security is.
Okay.
And we were there until September, and we were offered a position with the Holiday Inn in Lexington, Kentucky, to perform there 3 months out of the year and to book the entertainment for the rest of the time. So, which wasn't really all that lucrative, but it gave us, 9 months out of the year we could perform wherever we wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And so we left here to go do that. And so from that point on, Mac was president of the folk festival here and also taught. He was dean, but he also taught, I think Appalachian studies or something like that.
Okay.
And so he tied all this into the folk festival, and they had elder hostel programs going on at that
Yes.
time. And so Mac, during the folk festival, Mac would always contact me and ask me if I would come and work during those 2 weeks. Doing music. I even had to drive people around, that kind of thing, whatever you needed to do. Mm-hmm. And so I would do that pretty much every year until Mac left here in the mid-90s. And so for about a 10-year span, safely, I was in Glenville several times a year and worked here, at least during the month of June. Mm-hmm. So I stayed pretty familiar with what was going on.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you kind of mentioned that you're right before you basically signed on to, I guess, to make this your home or
Mm-hmm.
whatnot.
Final resting place.
You had been invited, and you were playing with the percussion ensemble.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And had anything been discussed prior to that?
No. As a matter of fact, I had decided that I didn't want to do it because I literally did not really understand what a percussion ensemble was. I just, and of course, Mr. McKinney quickly corrected me. He said, no, we don't pound things. He said, and so he sent me a videotape of the year before. And I saw this, and I thought, good grief, this is gorgeous. You know, this is great stuff. And so I called him back and I said, I'm sorry. I said, I had no idea, you know, what the percussion ensemble was all about. And I was hearing piano and strings and all this gorgeous music coming from those wood mallet instruments. And kids were so talented. I mean, but what you really end up with is that Mr. McKinney knows how to use what talent he has, and he knows how to develop those students. And so when they finish that percussion ensemble, they're pros. I've never worked with better pros in my life. I mean, they're just as good as it gets. So I came here.
So you were very, very impressed.
Impressed wasn't the word for it. I just said, yeah, I'll take all this I can get. This was fun. So I came up and did that performance and just fell in love with the whole concept. And then I don't know if Mr. McKinney had even thought about it before. I know Gary Gillespie had contacted me a few years before that to ask if I were interested in getting an interdisciplinary master's and coming here and, you know, teaching and being available to teach a few units of music history. And I was interested, but I really wasn't in a position where I could. So they may have talked about it before that, but.
So they were familiar with you because of your interaction?
Oh yeah, I had known Gary since I came to school here.
Yes.
And John was in school, I think he came to Glenville 2 years after I did. He started in '69.
Okay.
So we all knew each other, but we weren't really, I mean, it wasn't like, okay, let's meet after school for a beer or anything like that. Nothing, there was anything like that.
Yes.
But I wish now kind of that it had been, you know. But they were familiar with what I did, and I was familiar with what they were doing, except for what a percussion ensemble was. But shortly after that, probably in '98, it may have been '99, but I think it was '98. Mr. McKinney, I just walked in the office one day. I don't know what I was even over here for because the string class wasn't going on and I wasn't teaching it. But Mr. McKinney said, sit down a minute, I want to talk to you. And so he asked me if I were going to add traditional music, you know, mountain, Appalachian, West Virginia music, to the music curriculum, what would I do? What would I add? And I remember telling him, I got some ideas on that. So let me go home and I'll think it over. Well, I went straight home that evening and put together about a 15 or 20 page proposal. I mean, graphs, charts, you know, outlining exactly what the program should teach, what instruments, you know, and brought it back the next day. And just laid it in his lap. I said, I think this will answer your question from yesterday. So he looked at it and he said, yeah. So at that point, we both started working toward doing it. And I had not started teaching the string class yet. But at that point, we both started working on the idea of starting the bluegrass program.
But you were initially brought in to just as an adjunct, or?
I was brought in as an adjunct to do the string class, and meanwhile, I had done enough computer work, because you have to keep in mind this was in the mid '90s, and a lot of the stuff that we see in computers and stuff didn't exist.
So it was changing very rapidly at that time.
It's changing very rapidly. So I realized while I was in Arkansas that I better get some experience on a computer because I'm going to have to use this. I had seen in recording studios that they were using computers, recording to them.
Mm-hmm.
And while I didn't quite understand exactly what was going on at the time, I thought, well, this is where it's going. There's no question.
Yes.
So very quickly, I got familiar with PCs and Macs and what was going on in them. And so when I came back here, I already had enough knowledge to make some changes in the way they recorded and the way they videoed things down in fine arts.
Mm-hmm.
And so John just kind of unofficially sort of put me in charge of all that. He said, no, this is volunteer, and he said, the only money we can pay is for the string class. He said, but I'll give you an office, and you'll be one of us, And I said, fair enough. So I would spend, when I was off the road working with Jim and Jesse, I would be over here and we'd do work. And the first year I was here, I think this was right when Dr. Powell came in.
99.
99, yeah. Dr. Powell made it very clear to everybody that he was a big fan of public radio. And while I had only met him a couple times, Mr. McKinney was chair at the time. And so he would come back, and he came back one day and said, Dr. Powell is a big fan of public radio. And he said, what do you think we could do? I said, syndicate a radio program. I can do it. Because I'd done it several times. And so I knew the ins and outs, and I knew how to go about it. Mm-hmm. And so they came up with enough money for us to start a syndicated radio program. And for developing it, they paid me for like 6 months to develop the thing. So I was doing the adjuncting, and I was making enough money to make it worth my while to spend hour after hour after hour here. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we worked till like 1 o'clock in the morning. And but finally, in May of '99, we unveiled, we called it Mountain Air, and we had it on several stations throughout the country. What we did, we uploaded it to the public radio satellite system in Washington, D.C., and they then would upload it to their stations like the following day or maybe a couple days later.
It was recorded right here on site. We
recorded it right here. And so we would do interviews with different people. I did a lot of interviews with people at the Grand Ole Opry because I was there all the time.
Yes. How often was this radio show?
It was a weekly show.
Weekly.
Yeah. So they would upload the show to radio stations overnight. That's how they did it. Mm-hmm. And then the radio stations could take it for free. They just had to let us know that they were taking it. And at last count, there were several stations that were carrying it, but we weren't getting any money back for it. And my argument was that, no, this is advertising. Mm-hmm. You're getting free airtime on the radio. All you got to do is produce the show. And so, but eventually, after 5 years, and I'd had at least one heart attack in the process, we just had to end it. So it was just too much to do. Because we'd already started the Bluegrass Certificate Program. That was in 2002. And so we ran to 2004, and then we just ended it. We lost major funding, not major funding, but $2,000 or $3,000 that it would have taken to get the uploads paid for. And there was a contractual dispute between the state of West Virginia and the federal government, with the National Public Radio satellite system, mm-hmm. as to how they were to be paid, and they would not sign some of the West Virginia forms that had to be signed, and so funding just ended. But I was kind of glad of it because it was killing me, you know. But anyway, that was one of the 3 or 4 things that I did after I came back here, in addition to teaching the strings, and we started developing the bluegrass program.
Well, let's talk about the certificate prior.
All right. What the first thing we did in that direction was in 2002, we had I was still traveling and performing on the Opry, and had been for 5 years at that time. So we developed a fiddle camp to concur with coincide with the folk festival that year, and we had 10 or 12 people, you know, acquaintances that I'd known or got acquainted with through festivals and everything, come sign up. And we were promoting the fact that we were starting our bluegrass program that fall, and so we got a lot of students to come here, and some of them did end up coming to Glenville. So the fiddle camp was just kind of a kickoff to the whole thing. We were doing the classes. We had like 24 hours worth of classes that we were planning to do, and so Mr. McKinney and Dr. Powell, the president, Kathy Butler. Kathy was not the provost then. Dr. Freeman was. But anyhow, we developed the program, and then everybody was clamoring to get certificate programs going at that time, because we'd just lost
Extension.
the extensions of Parkersburg and Summersville. And so, yeah, and so we started doing the certificate program that fall, and our first student was Lizzie Long, who had come to the fiddle camp, and I had known her on the road. She played with a group called the Lewis Family, and I played with Jim and Jesse, and we did all the same shows basically. And so she came. She was the first student, and her sister Rebecca came a year or two later, and ended up being the first graduate in the degree program. But the certificate program is still in effect, but it was the first thing from 2002 to 2007. So then after the degree was approved, the program actually started growing.
The degree was approved
August 3rd, 2007.
Okay. And that actually, there was a little more to the approval of the degree as there was the certificate.
Quite a bit more. Not only was the degree approved, but it was approved unanimously by the Higher Education Policy Commission. But when the degree was approved, then we had to deal with, and we already pretty much had the rotation worked out from the certificate, but then some of the you know how they number the classes and upper division, lower division, like that. Some of those things had to be restructured and rechanged, or not rechanged, but changed, and so it took a year or two, even after the degree started, for us to get everything worked out so that everything just kind of worked smoothly and was in line with you know, the accreditation.
Course offering
people.
schedules. And
Exactly, yeah. But it was pretty much all worked out. It's just a matter of formality, basically.
Okay.
But we started the degree that fall in 2007.
Did you initially have interest from students?
Always had interest. How come you don't have a degree in this? That's a question I always got. And then now, and we should have done it at the time, but we didn't. We just wanted to get that degree. We did not make it a minor. And that, to me, a minor is going to make the program grow even more. And of course, they're working on getting that right now as we speak in 2013. But the minor, even with the degree, music degree in the bluegrass program, you'd be taking a lot more hours than what you would be if you were just majoring in, say, history and minoring in bluegrass music. So the effort now, which I disagree with, I think it's wrong, to get the number of hours down to 120.
But that's been a legislative mandate.
Yeah, what do they know?
Yes.
Yeah. There are already too many education courses and not enough content courses, certainly in music, but that's for somebody else to fight out.
Yes.
But anyhow, with the coming of that, the bluegrass music program here really needs the minor, because it'll make things more compact and more concise for people to make plans, and you won't have to be taking too many hours in one thing that you don't need. And before, when we just had the certificate, it didn't count towards your degree. It was just a certificate. So you could major anything you wanted to, and then take the certificate. So we had a couple music majors who also did the bluegrass program. And so they ended up taking 18 hours more than what they normally would have in 4 years. And so that we had to go a couple summers and do things. So the BA fixed that. I mean, it was not a teaching degree, but it was a BA degree. And so the bluegrass component became part of the degree.
Since the BA started in 2007, has the enrollment increased?
Mushroomed. Yeah, it's mushroomed. Not so much the first 2 or 3 years, but the last year that I was officially the director, and the first year in 2011, when Megan Darby was assistant director, and I was still the director, the program just tripled in size, and it's still growing. I truthfully don't know how she's going to handle all the growth, but she will.
When did the aspect of the Glenville State College Bluegrass Band begin?
With the certificate program, yeah.
So was that a requirement in one of the courses, or is it a requirement?
No, it's an ensemble. All programs really need an ensemble. You got the brass music people, they have an ensemble. Percussion majors, they have an ensemble. And strictly, originally, the bluegrass band started as a means to promote the program.
Yes.
And it actually, since we only had one student that first year, I would depend on some of the local more talented musicians to kind of augment the band, and we'd go out and play and advertise the band. We actually played on the Wheeling Jamboree in that situation. We had one student. We had 2 students, and went up and played Jamboree in the Hills. Under that Max Samples went with us. I think one of his brothers went with us and played, and so the following year we had a full band of students who were in the program. So that would have been in 2003.
So currently, I guess as it grows more and more, it may become more difficult to integrate each and every student that's in the program into the band, or do you not see it that way?
What's going to have to happen is this, and this is the same route that all the other schools who have programs. East Tennessee State University has a huge program, and they have several bands, but they have several people who run those bands. So there's each instructor. While we only have 2 instructors, they have several. So each instructor is required to lead an ensemble, as they call it. We call them bands.
Yes.
So the way Megan is handling it now, and I'm sure it's the way I would have had to handle it too, she divides the students into 2 groups. And she takes them all out on some occasions, some of them on other occasions. So, for instance, they're performing tonight as we speak. And
you're going to accompany them?
I'm going to accompany them tonight. This is March 22nd, 2013. I'll be there. But she'll have one half of the band performed the first set, and the other half of the band performed the second short set, and then they'll all kind of do something together for the big finale or at the end of the show. So it's already big. It's already
going to have to evolve.
It's going to have to evolve, and she's going to have some help eventually. And so the college is going to bite the bullet, and they're going to hire another professor in that area, which I'm sure they don't want to do. Nobody wants to spend money in a case like that, but you know, it's going to have to happen if that program continues to grow, and it will.
Okay.
It will continue to grow.
Can we take a moment, and if you feel comfortable doing so, to you know, basically toot the horn currently? I mean, is there anything good you can say about Miss Darby and her time here?
I can tell you this: when she first came here in 2005, I would guess.
She was a student, correct?
As a student, yeah. She was pointed out to me by one of our current students at that time, and said, "You need to get this girl." And so I went to see her perform, and here's this little old skinny kid, you know, playing a mandolin, wearing a hat, and when it came her time to perform, she jumped up to the microphone, and buddy, she played the stuff. She knew what she was doing, and so she came that fall, and what she did was the right way to do it at that time, because we just had the certificate, and that was extra. That was 18 extra hours. So she spent the first year here in the bluegrass program getting that certificate, and then at the end of that year, as planned, she finished the program, and she came back the following year, and she'd taken a few other courses during that year, but she came back the following year and immediately enrolled in elementary education. So she got the degree, she got the certificate out of the way first, and for a couple years she concentrated on getting her teaching degree. And in fact, when she finished, she was intern of the year, you know, and I mean, just sparkling record. But so a couple years later, she came back and started playing with the band again. And then the year before she graduated, I had gotten acquainted with her parents, and so I was up there visiting. We got a little jam session going on, and Megan just came over to me and she said, "I'm over on the porch. I want to talk to you." So we sat down in the porch swing, middle of the summer, and she said, "I don't quite know how to ask this, but I want your job," because I told her I was planning to retire.
And where was she from?
Athens, Ohio.
Okay.
And so I said, "If you're serious, I'll promote this idea." So she said, "I'm dead serious." She said, "This is the job I can do, and I want to do it." Meanwhile, Megan had worked at the largest bluegrass festival in the country, at Bean Blossom, Indiana, teaching kids to play music, leading the pack. You know, she was on the cutting edge. And
her maiden name was Murphy?
Murphy. Darby now, Murphy then.
Okay.
And so I said, "You'd be ideal." And so she was working, I think, in academic support at that time. And so I talked to the chair, and I talked to the provost, and
was she a student assistant at that time, or actually a full-time employee here?
Oh, she was a student assistant.
Okay.
So I talked to the people involved and said, she wants to be my replacement, and I want her to be my replacement. And I said, whatever it takes, that's what we'll do. So she came on as a student assistant with me. They transferred her down to Fine Arts as the assistant bluegrass person while she was still a student. And then she did that for a year, and then she graduated, and they hired her to to be my full-time assistant director.
Mhm.
And, or no, she wasn't graduated. She had finished her classes and was going into student teach. That's what it was.
Okay.
So as soon as she graduated with honors and intern of the year, I just told him, I said, look, she's starting her master's degree this fall, which, by the way, she'll finish in May with honors. And I told Dr. Peake, I said, now is the time for me to retire and for her to take this position. Because I want to retire. She wants the position. If we don't do this, we're going to lose her. She's going to go someplace else. And I said, this is the person that's going to take this program into the future, and she can do it. So they all concurred with this, and so she's the director.
So, would you say that basically you feel that you basically got the steam in the engines and got everything moving?
I'd have to say that. I'd have to agree with that. The spark, pretty much, was John McKinney.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he knew I could put it together. But I couldn't do it without guidance from people who were experienced in the education business, and he was the one.
Mm-hmm.
So he was the spark. I'm the one who did the initial legwork and the planning, and always with his approval,
Mm-hmm.
Until we got the certificate up and running and going. And then the truth of the matter is the BA, when it came along in 2007, we've been working on it for several years to get it ready. And the person who really put that together, I mean, you know, under direction of 2 or 3 different chairs and me, you know, was Carrie Minnie. She was our student office worker at that time, and she's the one who put it all in the right format and developed all the, you know, if you looked at the book now of the degree, of the
Mm-hmm.
Bachelor of Arts degree in music, she did all that work. So she was very instrumental in getting it done and getting it done quickly. So there were lots of people who were key people in getting this done, and yeah, I was the impetus for it probably, but you know, I didn't do all the work myself.
But you're of the feeling currently that you'd like to finish out your career, you know, back doing gigs and.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing right now.
But you're still. How do you envision the future? I mean, it's impossible to predict the future, but obviously you're playing with them tonight, so
Yeah.
you still feel connected to a degree.
Oh yeah, you feel connected even if you're not.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and there was a little rough area where, in order to be connected, sometimes that's misconstrued as interfering. You know, and so the last thing I would want to happen is somebody to think that Megan was not the full-fledged director of that program. She is, and boy, she's done a great job. She, in this phase of it, she's doing far better than I could have done.
Mm-hmm.
Planning was one thing, and making sure that all the, you know, all the right things were done to get it planned.
Mm-hmm.
But running the program, it takes someone who's got a lot of energy and who
Mm-hmm.
you know, of a vigorous nature, and she fits the bill.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, she's a great musician, singer, and she knows what she's doing.
I usually try not to interject any sort of opinions of myself into these interviews, but I will here. I think that Glenville State College has benefited greatly from your time here, and I also believe that you know, even though you've stepped back and whatnot, it's still a big help to us to have you involved at all.
Well, thank you, Jason.
And you know, having you somewhat as a face, you know, whether you, I know what you're trying to say. You don't want to always be the face of this program.
No,
but
you got to stop.
But it's a great benefit. The dedication that you've given.
Well, thank you. But that's, you know, that's pretty much it. The program is going to grow, and it's going to grow hugely. I think, and it's growing for the right reasons. We're not going out to get students just to have students, and we have strict standards to get them into the program and to get them out.
What do you think about the students that are currently enrolled?
I think I misread at least 3 or 4 of them originally, and I wasn't sure whether I should sign off on them coming into the program. But boy, was I sure wrong. I can't say names, but we have a group of students right now who are so talented, and when they get finished with this program and they graduate, they'll be able to step on stage with any band and sustain what they do.
Possibly take some of your work.
Exactly. Which I'm going to have to do something about that. Thanks for bringing it up, Jason. That's the whole idea, is take some of our work. You know, so it's nice to know that there's somebody out there who can step in, you know, when I can no longer do this, and that's coming, you know, I mean, that's always, you have to look at it like, well, that's going to happen. And so it's nice to know that there are 2 or 3 people right down here who can jump in and do that.
Okay.
You know?
Yes, exactly.
So that makes me happy.
One more thing I actually wanted to bring up, because I was a part of it with you last year. We ended up doing a small thing, I guess, is what we'd call it, a little brief.
Oh, the
event.
Appalachian thing.
Yes. Do you have anything to say about that? I mean,
I thought it was a great idea. At first, I was concerned about it interfering with the concept of the folk festival. And then, as the person who put the music part of it together, I mean, it was a full day of history and walking tours and all kind of thing, and some wine and cheese parties that I didn't get to go to. I was on duty all day. But really, as my last basically last official activity, pretty much, because we did it in April. I thought it was really something that should have been continued, and I was surprised that they didn't. But I do understand that it was a lot of work, you know, and planning and pulling something like this off and getting the funding and all that stuff. I just wish they'd done it another year so I could be paid. It's good. I didn't make any money for the gig
as
last
an
year.
entertainer, yes.
Yeah.
And basically, you were in charge of pretty much the music aspect of it and the concert, and that ended up being a huge success. From what would you?
I'd have to concur with that. The successful part of that was that we tried to get people who were, you know, at least would have some following. John Lilly was probably one of the reasons that worked so well, and in that, of course, he was
also part of our speaker series.
Yep, he was part of the speaker series, but he also is so well known around the state as the director of folk life for the state of West Virginia, editor of Golden Seal magazine, but he also is a great music historian, Appalachian music historian, and of course he does the Hank Williams tribute thing that we did at the concert last year. But the overall thing was, I wanted to take music from the old time mountain music into bluegrass and into more modern, if you want to call it that, electrified country music, which to me ended with people like Hank Williams and some of those people in the 50s. But it turned out that was a very successful format to follow. I wish we'd done it again. It would have been nice.
I don't want to talk any specifics about money, really, but do you think that with those type of funds, could something like that be put together? Would other people be able to do something like that?
Oh, I think so. I think you know, I'm not quite sure what the funding was for that whole thing, but I know they gave me a budget to work with, and I just called people up and says, "Here's what we can pay you." and so, but they ended up having enough money to pay mileage too for some of the key people. And I thought, well, gee, that's great, because that's not cheap. It wasn't cheap then, and it wouldn't be cheap now. But I think really with the same budget, you could probably do something as nice, I think.
Okay. So you greatly advise that we look into doing things.
Oh, I can't understand why it hasn't been done already. And look at Glenville. We have the college here, and we have the prison here, and the public school system. But what else, pretty much, is there here in this area, especially at that time of year, that can get people out? We have the percussion ensemble a few weeks before that. It's a totally different ballgame.
Probably a different crowd.
Different crowd. Some of the same people, but pretty much a different crowd. And for the people here who like Appalachian music, the folk festival deals specifically in old time, clawhammer, banjo, and fiddle. So you really don't get much of the in between, the bluegrass and the Nashville stuff. So I thought this was a great missing link, to the cultural heritage here. I'm just sad to see that it hasn't continued.
Do you envision or think that that these sort of efforts are the things that you've dedicated your life towards? Do you think that any benefit could come from the new center that's being built out at Mineral Road, the Waco Center? Basically, it's an inside larger. Basically, that's anything I can think of. Is it's an inside larger area for seating.
I haven't seen anything about that. So I really don't know. I don't know what their plans are for that. My guess is that it pretty much is going to end up being sports oriented, and primarily because of the name that's on the center.
Yes.
But I mean, it's still, yeah. Could you use it for something like that? I think most certainly you could, but I don't really expect that to happen. Not in my lifetime, But yeah, anytime you have a nice center like that with an auditorium, I would envision that something that size, they'd probably move commencement to that.
Oh yes, there will be. Yes.
Yeah.
I think there's a 3,000 seat conference type
Yeah.
area too.
Convocation, those kind of things probably would be best suited out there. College administrative activities, that kind of thing. Which would leave the Fine Arts Building auditorium to what fine arts is all about, and not crowd them out. I mean, for a while there were so many things going on in that auditorium that we just had to pick and choose times that we could do our own ensemble stuff.
The only restrictions that I can personally see with the Fine Arts Building is just seating. If we ever needed more seating,
Seats 500 people, pretty much. So you need bigger than that for.
And I know we did fill it up. We did fill it up with the Appalachian.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, it was a
and
big
several
crowd.
other events. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm not just.
Well, percussion ensemble fills it 2 nights, so, and the bluegrass band concert, which is in the fall, fills it up. So that's about the right size for all that stuff. If you got much bigger, it's, as a final note here, in auditoriums, there's a size of an auditorium that ranges between 500 and say 700 people, and this is pretty much a standard in the theater business. If you go to some of the off-Broadway theaters in New York, they won't really seat more than 500 or 600 people. You don't see 1,000-seat theaters in any of those places. But if you have a theater that seats 1,000, and at any time you never put more than 500 in it, it's devastating to the performers. Because even though that same 500 is a big audience, a standing room only in the Fine Arts Building down here,
Yes.
it looks like, they pay more attention to the empty seats than they do the full ones, when they see it. So psychologically, it's not good for performers. I've performed to crowds, as small as nobody, to like 90,000 people before. Mm-hmm. So, you end up, if you're a performer, you end up performing to whoever's standing in front of you, So it doesn't really bother, but a lot of people it does. And this is not I'm not saying this in any bad way, but generally trained performers, like that you find in the educational circuit, they're affected by it. People like me, hell, I sat and played, on the front porch for nobody,
Yeah.
So it doesn't bother me, and nor does it generally bother bluegrass people at all. But it's an issue for some people. So, but you go out to some of these theaters in Branson, Missouri, and Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, 700 people tops. That's as big as you need.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, but for something like this, I can see it happening. I would not want to take a group of students to perform in a theater that size with only 500 people in it. They'd see the other 2,500 seats empty, mm-hmm. And it would upset them.
Yes.
Plus it costs more to open that one up than it does this one.
Yes.
So it's all a matter of perception at that point.
Okay. Can you think of anything? I know we've covered a lot, but can you think of anything at all that we haven't talked about that you think is important that you'd like to say before we call it a day?
No, you've uncovered more dirt on me than I ever thought was out there. No, I think ultimately people who are involved in things like, one of the responses I get a lot from people are that we really think that what you're doing at the college is really nice, and they'll see students come out and play, and they often mistakenly credit me with what that student does. Primarily, when we bring students in to the program, they have to show quite a great deal of promise. It's like if you have a trumpet person coming from high school and auditioning for college, mm-hmm. There's a certain amount of literature that they have to be familiar with and have to be able to play, and certain techniques they have to be able to play, mm-hmm. or they won't get in. And so I held the bluegrass program to the same standard. They have to be able to play some, at least some basic things, and have at least, a promising amount of talent to get into it. So the point I'm getting at here is, generally when they get here to that point, they already really can play, and all I do is steer. And teach, build on what they know, mm-hmm. but steer them into hopefully something so that they won't make some of the same career mistakes that I've made and other people have made. So I always looked at myself pretty much as the guide who leads them through all this, rather than the mentor and the person from whom they get everything, and that's just not the case.
I know it's tough to generalize this, but would you be able to say that the majority of the time that these students that enroll in this program and become a part of it, do they end up being exceptional students in other areas too?
Oh, without question. I can name 4 or 5 who've been that way. I won't use any particular names, but one. Let me count here now. 2, 3. At least 3 of my students since the degree started, mm-hmm. have also been intern of the year, and they've gone on to very successful professional positions.
You mean it's for student teaching? Is that?
If they're a music ed, yeah. Unfortunately, in bluegrass we don't have anything. They do intern stuff, but it's not as visibly readily available to the college community as student teaching is, because basically we're a teacher's college. And there are others that I can point out right now that are in the program that, based on what I know about them and what I've seen and what their record is so far, I would be foolish to say that they wouldn't be doing the same things. You know, so we have been very fortunate. If you get someone who's good at playing an instrument, or good at performing, good at talking on stage, that all fits into the bluegrass program as well as anything else. And if you find people who fall into those categories, they're going to be successful at pretty much anything they attempt. And I will finish with this. When I was a senior in high school, I was voted most likely to succeed, and every once in a while I'll run into people that I went to high school with, and they said, "Boy, we were just so right about you." You know, what they don't realize is success does not carry with it the financial rewards that working for years as what most people would call an under position. You know, success is what you accomplish. Has nothing to do with the money. So in that respect, I tell them, yeah, I think I was successful. And I think I was. Monetarily, no. But what are you going to do with money when you die?
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thank you.